Okay? All right. So last week, on last Thursday, April 19th, in our sixth meeting, we were discussing the Pentagon Papers case. That, as I indicated then, it was called by more than one of the justices of the United States Supreme Court the most important legal case that they had ever seen in their entire lives. And it ended in a 9-0 ruling in a per curiam opinion in which all of the justices joined, stating that it was their conclusion that the federal government, Richard Nixon, John Mitchell's Justice Department, had failed to meet the extremely heavy burden that they would have to meet in order to consider getting a prior restraint on the New York Times. But as you recall, there were 9 concurring opinions that were written. 3 very they were concurring. They were concurring in the per curiam, but what they said is they thought that the 3 of them, for example, very importantly, White and Stewart and Berger, insisted upon suggesting that there should be criminal prosecutions, that it was a mistake for the Justice Department to try to seek an injunction in this case, and therefore they recommended that there be strong consideration given to criminal prosecutions. This would have, of course, entailed prosecuting Punch Sulzberger, the editor-in-chief of the New York Times, Abe Rosenthal, Tom Wicker, Scotty Reston, Hendrick Smith, and of course James Goodall, their general counsel, all of whom were named as defendants in the effort to get a restraining order. Now, and of course this would have included the source, whoever the source was at that particular time. After the final oral argument that we had made in front of the Supreme Court on June 26th, I was assigned by the Cahill firm to prepare potential criminal defenses for all of these people in light of the fact that the questioning that had come from Potter Stewart and Whizzer White and Berger had indicated that they were going to suggest criminal prosecutions. And I was preparing the criminal defenses for all of the people. But of course, I did not know at that time who the source was. But I had assumed that the source was someone who was an inside person at the Pentagon somehow who had direct access to this top secret classified study that had been done. And so I was preparing some additional defenses for that person, such as U.S. v. Gorin, that we had discussed earlier, that whoever the source was, his giving the information to the New York Times was not exactly the same thing as giving it over to the enemy with a specific intent, criminal intent, that person the enemy of our country do damage to the United States. So I was in the process of preparing these types of defenses. But of course the Nixon White House at that particular time was under very heavy fire. Not only had they lost each one of the decisions at each of the lower courts all the way to the Supreme Court, with the exception of the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, which merely suggested that it had to go back down to the court in D.C. to have further information, further evidence taken, which was an attempt, obviously, on the part of the court to get the Justice Department to cure its original error, which was in their failure to give any information whatsoever to the courts to support any specific allegation of any specific irreparable damage that was going to be done. As you remember, Whitney Norris Seymour in the New York case had taken the position that the court was not cleared through a top secret security clearance to get access to the information, and so they refused to present any information to the court at all. And I had thought that would pretty much end the case, but for the counsel from the New York Times agreeing to provide a copy of the papers to the court as a courtesy. But the bottom line is that the Justice Department under Mitchell, John Mitchell and Richard Nixon, didn't really believe that it had the political muscle really to go after all of these people. So they turned their attention primarily to focusing on trying to figure out who the source was. We completed our final oral argument in front of the United States Supreme Court on the 26th of June of 1971. And then on the 27th of June, we learned that the FBI had wiretapped our office, our law offices, the Cahill-Gordon law firm. A member of the FBI contacted Scotty Reston, James Reston, on the board of editors of the New York Times, and told them that our law firm had been wiretapped. They had tapped my phone and the phone of Floyd Abrams to try to determine whether or not we were discussing with James Goodell, legal counsel for the New York Times, who the identity was of their source. However, on the very next day, 2 days after we had argued in the Supreme Court in Washington, and 2 days before the Supreme Court rendered their opinion, Daniel Ellsberg turned himself in to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston, admitting that he, in fact, was the one who had provided the papers. So then I learned who the source was, and it turns out that that is on June 28th of 1971, 2 days after we'd finished our oral arguments. In the first week of August, the White House Director of Domestic Policy, John Ehrlichman, assigned Eagle Crow and David Young, 2 staff members in the White House, to create a plumber's unit, a unit to try to plug the leaks that had been flowing to the New York Times and others. Nixon was extremely upset about this, so John Ehrlichman directed this staff to put together a plumber's unit to plug the leaks. And Krogh and Young hired a former FBI agent from Poughkeepsie, New York, by the name of G. Gordon Liddy, to head up this unit. And in the second week of August of 1971, Liddy hired E. Howard Hunt, a Central Intelligence Agency guy, to be on this team with him. And they met downstairs in the basement of the old executive office building next to the White House. They met downstairs with Eagle Krogh and Young, and they proposed, this is G. Gordon Liddy, they proposed a project which they called Operation Gemstone. And they proposed, but they were wanting to protect the family jewels, they said, of the administration. And so they called it Project Gemstone, and they proposed a series of things, including burglarizing the office of the psychiatrist of Dan Ellsberg. They had determined that they could tell from a lot of our arguments that we'd made in front of the court, and they realized that they had a problem in trying to prosecute the board of editors of the New York Times because of U.S. v. Gorin, that they would have to prove this specific evil intent on the part of the publishers of the New York Times, and they realized they wouldn't be able to make that test. And so they were hoping they could get some evidence as to the state of mind of Daniel Ellsberg when he had provided these documents. And so given the great high level of intelligence inside the White House at that time, they said, okay, state of mind of Daniel Ellsberg, let's go to his psychiatrist, and we'll burglarize his office and see what they've got in there. So they sent a memo after this meeting downstairs in the first week of August of 1971. Eagle Krogh drafted a memo and sent it to John Ehrlichman, asking for his permission for them to burglarize the psychiatrist's office for Daniel Ellsberg. And Ehrlichman gave them permission to do that on the condition that it could not be traced back to the White House. And the theory of it was that they viewed this as a breach of national security, and that therefore they were authorized to go in and burglarize a place in order to get information which was essential to the protection of the national security of the United States. And they didn't have to get a warrant, and so they sent them in. On September 3rd of 1971, Hunt and Liddy and 3 Cubans by the name of Eugenio Martinez, Felipe de Diago, and Bernard Barker went into the psychiatrist's office, ransacked the office, tried to make it look like there had been a burglary of somebody that was, looking for something really valuable in a psychiatrist's office, like files. and tore the place up and then left. Now, at this time, in September of 1971, the trial was scheduled for Daniel Ellsberg to start in the beginning of 1973. They were going to give him basically 18 months before they got prepared for the trial. And so in September of 1971, after they burglarized the office, they were getting ready to give a date for the trial. And it was at that point that I learned in September of 1971 that the Cahill firm, Cahill, Gordon, Sonnet, Reindel, and Ohl, which was the firm that I was with that had represented the New York Times, who had now taken the Times account, the legal account, away from Lord Day and Lord, and we were representing the New York Times. I had assumed that since we were going to be doing all the defenses for the people from the Times on the theory that they might be named as co-conspirators with Daniel Ellsberg, I had assumed that we were going to be doing the defense of Daniel Ellsberg as well. I'd prepared his legal defense in full detail, only to be told by the senior partner of our firm, Larry McKay, that we were not going to represent Ellsberg, that we would agree to represent the Times people, but we would not represent Ellsberg. He said that it was one thing to defend the New York Times for $1 million retainer. It was another thing to defend a traitor. I was rather struck by this, declaring that Daniel Ellsberg was a traitor. I had a fairly intense set of discussions with Larry McKay, the senior partner. Now, of course, as I mentioned, this wasn't my first intense conversation with Larry McKay, the senior partner. I'd had a discussion with him after we did the Courtright case, Courtright versus Reeser, where I represented, along with other people from the law commune, the drum major and the others from the 1st U.S. Army Regimental Band that I told you about. That had not gone over terribly well with the senior partner. I had also done the case in May of 1971 of the Black Panther, Panther 21 trial, in which after an 18-month trial, they were acquitted in less than 45 minutes. I don't know if did I tell you about when we got the verdict in the Panther trial that Judge Murtaugh, when they came in with 157 innocent verdicts, and Judge Murtaugh pounded his gavel and said there's no such thing as an innocent verdict. You've got to go back into that jury room and come back with either 157 guilty verdicts or 157 not guilty verdicts. And they went back in, and 3 minutes later they came out with 157 innocent verdicts. Again, anyway, this had been a fairly large event in New York history, and so the senior partner, Larry McKay, was not too happy with that either. He called me into the firm upstairs and said, what is it? Why do you keep doing things like this? And I was trying to explain to him, what really happened is that after the verdict came in, and they were all acquitted. It was on the front page of all the newspapers. And I came back to the office and I sent an inter-office memo around inside Cahill thanking all of the other lawyers who had responded to my request for assistance and helping to provide the defense for them. And so a day passed and there was this huge mumbling going around inside the firm going, who else helped him? Who was that? And after 2 days, they realized that it was no one who had done that. And so Larry McKay thought that was a little bit rude on my part to have sent the memo around thanking everybody for all the help they'd given. And I figured that they would think that after an 18-month criminal trial, when it only took a jury 45 minutes to come up with 157 innocent verdicts, that someone would have thought that was an appropriate thing to do, to have defended people on a case like that. But he didn't. And then in September of 71, there was the Attica prison case, the prison riot case. That was another one that Larry McKay thought that I was kind of wondering what I was doing, arguing on behalf of inmates in the prison. And of course, I had also been appointed by Mayor John Lindsay, the Republican mayor of New York, to be the lawyer for all of the inmates in the Manhattan House of Correction for men. And there had been a major riot that had gone on in the Tombs, and I'd been called by Warden Glick to come and to negotiate with the hostages or excuse me, with the inmates. So I was there, and I had this long discussion with the inmates. They went through this big long list of grievances that they had, including the fact that the police always lied, committed perjury constantly in the cases, planted evidence on people, engaged in illegal searches with no warrants. And so I copied down all these complaints that they had and brought them back to Glick, and Glick was terribly upset about this. The riot continued. He thought I was supposed to talk them into quitting. And I said, actually, they've got a lot of really legitimate grievances here. And so they scheduled a press conference the next day, so ABC television was there, and I was asked to appear there. So I was there and listing out what their grievances were. And one of the people from ABC stood up and said, you don't actually support any of these grievances, do you? You don't actually agree with any of these grievances, do you? And I said, well, actually, I do. I said, I'm perfectly aware of the fact that perjury is suborned virtually every day by the district attorney's office in New York City. And they were completely shocked by that. And I said, a little statistic you may not realize, I said, in the last 25 years in the city of New York, can anybody tell me how many search warrants have been issued? And there were various guesses of 100, 200, 300. Zero. Zero search warrants had actually been issued in the city of New York because the police never bothered with them. And the district attorney's office never bothered with them. And so somebody stood up and said, are you suggesting that Frank Hogan, the district attorney of the city of New York, would actually suborn perjury? I said, absolutely. And I'm not only suggesting it, I'm positive that it's true. And so that went out all over the airwaves, and people got all upset, and they called the law firm, and they complained about it. So I went to see Larry McKay again at his request and explained to him that I'd never used the firm's name. There was no reference to the firm at all. There wasn't any, in any of the coverage, there'd never been any reference to the law firm, et cetera. And so all this had been going on by the time I had this major discussion with Larry McKay about him saying that Dan Ellsberg was a traitor and he wasn't going to, the firm wasn't going to represent him. And then in the spring of 1972, a case came up in the law firm where one of the clients of the Cahill firm, a power company called the Arkansas Missouri Power Company, wanted us to defend them because they were attempting to purchase all of the stock of an all-black owned power company down in Louisiana. And a complaint had been filed with the Federal Trade Commission trying to block the sale. So Dan James, one of the partners, senior partners, called me into the office and he asked me, he said, look, Dan, he said, I know that you worked with some folks at the Harvard Law School with Alan Dershowitz and some others, and you guys won a motion to get standing for an environmental protection group in New York, the Scenic Hudson Group, that they wanted to stop the state of New York from blowing up the entire side of a cliff and collapsing it into the Hudson River so they could build a power plant there. And we helped get standing for the Scenic Hudson Group to get standing and filed an action and got an injunction stopping them from doing this. So he said, I realize that you were very effective in figuring out how to get standing and stuff like that because they are the ones that actually represented the power company that was wanting to do this. And he said, so would you figure out a memo, a legal memo, that can deny standing to the people who are the customers of the all-black power company in Louisiana who are trying to intervene and stop the Federal Trade Commission from authorizing the purchase of these stock? And I told him, no, I didn't think I would do that at all. And he said, what do you mean you aren't telling me you aren't going to do it, are you? I said, no, I'm not going to do it. And he said, well, look, if you want to tell me that you don't have time to do it, then that may be something different. And I said, okay, then I don't have time to do it. He said, it's all right, it's no rush. He said, you can take your time to do it. I said, look, I'm never going to have time to do that. And he had gotten very irritated, called Larry McKay. So I ended up going back up to talk to Larry McKay again. Dan, why do you keep doing things like this? I tried to explain to him how unethical it was. I thought that they were in a good legal counsel is advising people to abide by the law and do proper things. So all of that had been going on till one more case came up, which was the we represented, our law firm represented the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, A&P, right? And turns out that the president of A&P had his office in New York City, and he received a telephone call in early June of 1972 from Jesse Jackson, Operation Breadbasket out of Chicago. And he was calling to talk to the president of A&P. He wanted to have an appointment with him. In the executive secretary, the president of A&P said, "Oh, Reverend Jackson. Oh, great." And he said, "So I'd like to have an appointment with the president. Can you see if he's got some time?" And so she says, "Well, look, I've got his calendar here. He's got an opening next Thursday afternoon, like at 2 o'clock. And Jesse Jackson said, "Well, good, then we'll be there." She said, let me check with him to make sure there's no problem. So she goes in, she talks to the president of A&P and says, "Look, there's Reverend Jackson on the phone, and he'd like to have an appointment with you next Thursday, like at 2 o'clock. And there's nothing scheduled." He said, "Absolutely not. I'm not going to meet with them because I know what they want. What they're going to do is they're going to be protesting. They're asserting that A&P engages in what they call discriminatory pricing in the ghetto areas. What that means is they charge 20% more for everything in the store because the people don't have the wherewithal to engage in comparative shopping. They can't really go long distances and find other stores that are available to do comparative shopping, so they can get away with charging them. I know what they want to talk about. I'm not going to meet with them." And so she goes back and she gets on the phone and she says, "Oh, Reverend Jackson, I'm so embarrassed." She said, but he says he won't meet with you." And Jesse Jackson says, "Well, that's okay. I know he's got the space open. Just keep that space open and we'll be there." So the following Thursday comes, and 2 o'clock, into the office up on the 16th floor, walk in, 3 Catholic nuns, 2 black ministers, and a Catholic priest, right? They walk in and they say, we're here to meet with the president." And she goes, "Oh, this is very embarrassing. The president says he doesn't want to meet with you." They said, "We know, but Reverend Jackson said that the space was open, and so we've come to meet with him." So she goes in and she tells the president, and the president comes out and he looks out there and he says, "Get them niggers out of my office," he says, right within their hearing. At which point they took root in the office and planted themselves and decided they weren't going to leave. And so the day goes by, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, comes to be 5 o'clock. And at 5:01, the president comes out and says, "Okay, that's 5 o'clock. Business is closed. Time for everybody to leave." So he scoots everybody out of the office, but they continue sitting there. And so he calls the police. So he calls the New York's finest, actually New York's only. It calls them, and they come up. And they come into the office, and they see the priest, and they see the nuns, and they're going, "Listen, sorry, Father, sorry, sister, but I got to take." So they pick them up, and they carry them out of the office. And they bring them on the elevator, and they carry them down, and they set them down in the street. Okay? Next morning at 9:01, they're back. They come back in, and they sit down, and they start waiting again. So he gets on the phone, and he calls Larry McKay, our chief counsel, and demands that we go into the court and get an injunction prohibiting them from coming back into this office, right? So the word goes out all around the firm that McKay's looking for somebody to file an injunction to get these people to leave the office, right? So about halfway through the morning, I get a call from one of the senior associates, and he asked me to come in, so I come in and sit down. And he says, "My, Danny, isn't it nice weather? How you feeling? Are you having a good time here? Blah, blah." I'm saying, yeah, right. He says, "You may have heard, the firm has been asked to get an injunction on behalf of A&P to stop these black ministers and stuff from coming into their office." I said, yeah, I heard about that. He says, "Who in the world are you guys planning to get to do something like that?" And he goes, "Well, actually, the executive committee has been meeting all morning, and they've decided they want to ask you to do that. Those kind of people. Those kind of people, and they thought you'd be the best one to do that." I said, right. I said, who are you guys really going to get to do that? I mean, how can, it seems like kind of a difficult. He went, no, I mean it. They asked you to do it. And so I said to him, I said, "Look, the most that you could ask of me is that I not question your own personal moral integrity for having anything to do with a case like that. At which point, this kind of stunned look comes over his face, and he immediately starts telling me this story. Look, he said, I'm sorry. He said, I feel really strange. He said, but I've got to tell you this thing that happened to me. He said, back years ago, when I was just a young guy, my brother was at Columbia University back in the 50s, and he was writing his PhD thesis on the Soviet Union. And 2 FBI agents came to our apartment and knocked on the door, showed me their credentials, and said they were looking for my brother. And they said that they'd gotten information that he had checked books out of the library at Columbia that had to do with the Soviet Union. And they were trying to find out what he was doing. And so they left their cards, and they said, have your brother call when he gets back in. So he said, my brother came back in later on that afternoon, and I told him, I gave him the card and told him what had happened, and he started to cry. And he went in, he got all of his papers all together. There was his whole PhD thesis, and started putting them into the fireplace and burning them. And that's the story he told me, right? Like just kind of sui sponte. He just tells me that story. So I get up and leave, and wouldn't do the case. And so they started freaking out, right? So Larry McKay calls me and asked me to come up to meet with him. And he says, look, Dan, that we're lawyers. When people call us, we're supposed to respond. That people need legal help. We've got to agree to do these kind of cases for people, et cetera. And so look, I want you got to stop doing this. You did it on the Arkansas, Missouri power case. Now you're doing it on the AMP case. You got to stop doing this. And so the following week, fortunately, I get called by Father Arthur Brown from the Archdiocese of Boston. And the Archdiocese of the Catholic Church in Boston wants me to represent the Berrigans. The Berrigans have been arrested down in Harrisburg. There's a charge that they were conspiring to kidnap Henry Kissinger as a showpiece, and that they decided that since they knew me, that I knew Cardinal Cushing and the guys from Boston, and
who were the Berrigans?
That the Berrigan brothers were these famous Catholic priests, Daniel Berrigan and Phil Berrigan, Liz McAllister, a Catholic nun, and some others, and they had been going around raiding draft boards. They had a whole covey of Catholic priests and nuns and stuff, and they would go around and they would go into draft boards during the night, and they would take all the draft board files out, and they would take them out into the parking lot, and they would pour human blood on the files and burn them and hold a mass there. And they were doing this all around the country, and they had destroyed the draft board files of dozens of draft boards, and these 2 Catholic priests were on the 10 most wanted list for the Nixon administration. And they would show up in Catholic churches around the country doing Mass on Sunday morning and doing sermons, doing the homily, and talking about against the war in Vietnam. And the FBI would come, after they left about an hour, they'd come swooping into the church looking for them, and they'd be long gone. So there was this whole Robin Hood thing going on. And so anyway, they'd charge the Berrigans with conspiring to kidnap Henry Kissinger. And so the Catholic Archdiocese had decided they were going to put up the money, $1 million they offered to retain me to represent them. And they wanted our firm, the Cahill firm, to stand behind it to represent the Berrigan brothers, Fathers Berrigan. And so I get to go in to see Larry McKay. And so I go into Larry McKay and I said, you were telling me the other day about how we need to really represent the people who come and ask us. And you remember you told me that it was one thing to represent the New York Times for $1 million, and it was another thing to represent a trader. Well, here we are. We've been offered $1 million by the Catholic Archdiocese of Boston, and to do this. And he freaked out and said, what is this? He started going like that. And I started saying, well, look, I thought we wanted to be consistent here. I was kind of taking to heart the information you gave me. So I thought we ought to consider doing this. So he was adamant that this was not a proper thing for us to do, but he'd take it to the executive committee. Okay? And so I waited a couple of days and I called him up. What's the executive committee said? Well, look, Dan, why don't you come on up and we'll talk about this. So we come up and he tells me that the executive committee has thought better of doing this, that they thought it probably wasn't a good idea. It might offend some of our other clients. And then he raised this thing again about us representing Ellsberg and how that it was probably better for us to get someone else to represent Ellsberg. And so what I did is I took all of my files I copied all of my files that I had prepared all the defenses for the New York Times people and for whoever the source was, and it was for Ellsberg, and I now knew who it was. And I took them over to Leonard Bodine. Leonard Bodine, of Rabinowitz, Bodine, and Standard, was an old-time classic progressive, like in the Clarence Darrow kind of mold. So I brought the files over to Leonard Bodine and recommended that they take the case and represent Ellsberg, and that recommended that they retain Charlie Nesson, who was a Harvard Law School professor in criminal law. And so I did that, and a week later, I was called into that same associate's office that I had declined to do the A&P case for, and he said that the firm had decided, they thought I'd be happier elsewhere. And I said, no, I'm fine. I'm fine. This is perfectly good. You know, I get to do the New York Times stuff. I did Eisenstadt. I did the Pentagon Papers case. I represented the New York Times against the Jewish Defense League, you know, who had tried to get an injunction mandating that the New York Times publish a full-page ad, you know, dumping on Leonard Bernstein, the conductor of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra, because he had given a contribution to the Black Panthers. And that the Jewish Defense League under Rabbi Meir Kahane wanted to get a full-page ad and make the New York Times publish it. And the New York Times refused to do it. So they brought a federal action trying to get an injunction, trying to invoke the fairness doctrine that just like a radio station or a television station, if they broadcast something of a political nature, they have to agree to give an opposite position. Well, that doesn't apply to the New York Times. And so it turned out Floyd Abrams didn't want to take on the Jewish Defense League. As I told you before, our law firm is half Irish partners and half Jewish partners, and that so he comes to me and said, why don't we get the MIC to do this? And so I said, okay, I'll do this. And it turns out I even liked it better because the Jewish Defense League in Meir Kahane was being represented by Roy Cohen. See? Now, so you can get some noise out of that, people that are a little older. But now Roy Cohen is a total snake in the grass that you guys don't know about. That Roy Cohen was this total scumbag who was legal counsel for the McCarthy Committee. And now the McCarthy Committee you've heard about, the ones that went after everybody, you know, anybody who read more than 2 books a year, you know, that they're communist fellow travelers, all that stuff. Anyway, Roy Cohen was their legal counsel. And so Roy Cohen just lives in infamy among the progressives as who he was. So here he is, shows up representing the Jewish Defense League in Meir Kahane. And so Floyd asked me if I would do the case for the New York Times, full representation for the New York Times against the Jewish Defense League. So I did it. And then they asked me to be on a radio show with Meir Kahane and Roy Cohen, because Floyd didn't want to go there either. So I did. And so I went in there, and right at the beginning of the radio show, I said, you know, look, I want to make it clear that I consider both of you guys to be total scumbags, okay? And so, look, so don't think that I'm going to pay you the least bit of respect during this radio interview. You know, I think you're both criminals and ought to be under the prison at Folsom Prison somewhere. You know, so the whole interview went downhill from there, and so Floyd was actually ecstatic. And so he invites me to come to his house, first time he had, and I got to meet his wife, Sabra, who had been born in Israel, and he introduces me to Moshe Dayan. Now, see, there's another one. See, you don't know who Moshe Dayan is either. Moshe Dayan was a guy, one of the most famous warriors for the state of Israel. He was a fantastic commanding general of the Israeli forces, and there he is at Floyd Abrams' house, you know, sitting there in his living room. So I get to go in, I get to meet Moshe Dayan and Floyd's wife. So I thought I was in pretty good shape, but they thought that I'd be happier elsewhere. And so I told them, no, I'm fine, I'm having a good time here. And but then a week later, they called me back in and said the executive committee has met, and they have decided that they're going to terminate you. And I said, terminate? Terminate? I said, is that the same thing as fired? And he said, oh, no, we don't fire people here at Cahill. We do not. But they've told me that I have to notify you that you're terminated as of today. And it turns out that I was not the first person in history to be terminated by the Cahill firm. I was the second person. The other one was Alger Hiss. It's just, but the Alger Hiss, you probably don't know either. Alger Hiss is a guy, very famous guy, Harvard Law School graduate, was at the Cahill firm, was in the State Department, and he was accused of being a Russian sympathizer and actually accused of transferring information to the Russians from the State Department. And Big Long is another one of those cases like the Rosenberg case where most of the progressive community believes that it was a total crock, the charges against him, and every right-wing person believes that he was Satan incarnated. But anyway, he wasn't. But he was the other guy that was terminated from the Cahill firm. So that was on June 15th of 1972, I was terminated. So I went straight from the office down to the unemployment office and signed up for unemployment and made the firm write a letter telling them why I'd been dismissed. So they wrote a letter saying that I had been dismissed for engaging in public interest cases contrary to the firm's policy. Now, as I mentioned to you before, I had a whole signed contract with them, being able to do half of my cases on public interest cases. But I wasn't going to get into a big fight about it because I was going to get unemployment anyhow. And so I went down to the McGovern headquarters on June 15th, and I walked in, and there's Joe Grandmaison. Joe Grandmaison is the guy who's in charge of the New York State Democratic campaign for George McGovern. And I knew Joe Grandmaison back in 1968. When I was at Harvard Law School, we were trying to get Bobby Kennedy to run to oppose Lyndon Johnson in the primary. And he kept resisting and resisting and resisting. And finally, when we concluded that he wasn't going to run, the decision was made to go see Eugene McCarthy and see if he would run for the nomination against Johnson. And Joe Grandmaison and Gary Hart were the two guys that went to see him and talked him into doing it. And then when Eugene McCarthy almost beat Lyndon Johnson in the New Hampshire primary in the spring of 1968, Lyndon Johnson withdrew. And Bobby Kennedy came into the campaign and was then on his way to the White House. So I had known Joe Grandmaison. So I walked in, and there's Joe. And so he says, "Oh, what do you want to do?" And so I said, "Well, what position is open here?" And he said, "Well, there's the 14th Congressional District out in Brooklyn." I said, "The 14th Congressional District, isn't that John Rooney's district?" He said, yes, that's Rooney's district. John Rooney was another guy that's just to the right of Attila, the Hun, and was actually a Democrat. He was the Democratic chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. And so I go out to the 14th Congressional District, and I wander, and I set up a little office there and start running McGovern's campaign out there. I actually walked into one of the stores, a drugstore, and told him that I was here working with the Democratic Party and that I was going to be working for McGovern, and the guy looked like this, and he said, "Are you opposed to Rooney?" I said, "No, I'm not here taking any position against Rooney at all." He says, "Because Rooney, I think he's a really great guy." He says, and he goes just like that. And I went, "Whoa, man, this is a pretty tough district out here." So anyway, so I went to every one of the American Legion meetings. I went to every PTA meeting. I went to every dog fight that they had. Anything they had. I went everywhere and was telling everybody, just tell us what you want. Tell me what you want. Tell me what you want, constantly. And they'd never had anybody ask them that. And so I was collecting all kinds of information about things they needed done and wanted done. A lot of them were unhappy with Rooney. I was taking the information and giving it to Allard Lowenstein, because Allard Lowenstein was the guy running against him out in the 14th Congressional District. And so I was giving him all the information, and it turns out we won the primary. We won the primary for George McGovern in John Rooney's district out in the 14th CD. So they were ecstatic at the headquarters, and I come in, and they introduced me to Pierre Salinger, who was the honorary chairman of the campaign out there in New York, and Bob Wagner, who was the governor, was the former mayor. So they asked me what I wanted to do, and I became the head of all voter registration in the state of New York. So we did a bunch of great things there. I rented Madison Square Garden, and I got, well, first thing that happened is I got the Isley Brothers. These are all people you guys don't know. I got the Isley Brothers to actually come and do a free concert up in Harlem. And then everybody that came, I had them, for the price of admission, they had to register to vote. And it was against the law to register any place else other than at the Board of Elections, which was only open from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. And it turns out that nobody cared because they didn't want any more registered voters because the political machines, Republican and Democrat in New York, wanted to work just with the people they knew. They didn't want a whole lot of new influx. They didn't want anything changing. I knew perfectly well that if McGovern was going to have any chance of winning, we had to have all kinds of young people, black people, Hispanic people, Puerto Rican people. We had to get everybody registered. So I filed a major federal lawsuit and won, getting it declared unconstitutional to limit the voter registration. And so we were allowed to have mobile voter registration. So we set up the mobile registration outside of the big stadium in Harlem and got everybody registered. And then I rented the Madison Square Garden, and we got Simon and Garfunkel to, now we're cutting into the territory here. So we got Simon and Garfunkel, who hadn't been together for like 3 years, to come back together to play for the first time. And we got Mike Nichols and Elaine May to come and do a shtick, you know, and so we filled the whole place up and registered everybody to vote, making tons of contributions and stuff, and so I got to do all this, and so I'm in a meeting one afternoon with this is getting along towards September, late August now, and I'm in the meeting with Gary Hart and some other people that are in the meeting, and the lady from out in the hallway that is our receptionist. Comes in and she says, Danny, they knocked me down. They knocked me down. I said, what? And she said, oh, they knocked me down. So I get up and I go out into the reception area, and there's about 6 or 8 guys wandering all around in the reception area. And there's this one guy, and he's putting a big chain and padlock onto the operator's thing where they punch the little buttons in for the telephones, you know, the old-timey operator things. So I walk over to him, I say, what are you doing here? And he turns around and he goes like that, and he pushes me like that. Big mistake. So I reach out and I grab him and I snatch him like this, and I bang him on the floor, and I pick him up and I march him over to where the door is and turn him around and push him and kick him square in the ass like that, and he goes airborne down the stairs, bangity, 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 bang, down the stairs. And just as I get my foot squarely in his butt, these television cameras all come on. And they've got television camera people with them. And so I ended up on the front page of the national gay newspaper because it turns out that McGovern had, now that he got the nomination, had refused to make any more positive comments about gay and lesbian rights. And so that they wanted me to prosecute, that they wanted me to testify against these people. I refused. I found out that he had made promises to support the gay and lesbian community. He wouldn't do it now. So I refused to testify. And Frank Hogan, the district attorney of New York, was threatening to prosecute me for obstructing justice. And I said, go ahead, see how far that one gets you. You know, and so the bottom line is that, and then McGovern ends up dumping Eagleton, his vice president, and picks another vice presidential candidate, and then he gives F-111s to Israel. And so I said, look, I'm getting tired of this, and I walked out in the first week of September and received a telephone call from F. Lee Bailey. Bailey had been wanting me to come to work for him in Boston for some time, and so I ended up deciding...
The guy that kicked down the stairs was a gay activist.
Oh yeah, these were the gay activists. That's right. They'd come in and they were making a big protest, and that was what this was all about. It was a big protest demonstration. It was the first time I'd ever been on the other side of a protest. And so, anyway, so I refused to testify against them, and they had all the charges dismissed against them. So I end up going to work for F. Lee Bailey, and I go I show up at F. Lee Bailey's office on the 15th of September, which turns out to be the day that the fellow who'd been working when they burglarized the Watergate hotel had turned himself into the FBI and had provided evidence against Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt. So I show up there at the office on that day. And it turns out that F. Lee Bailey's office is representing James McCord, who is the wiretap specialist in the Watergate burglary. So there I am at the office. I'm one of the 3 trial lawyers now in F. Lee Bailey's office. And now up to this point in our course, the cases that I've talked with you about, the ones that we did, the conflict underlying those legal cases up to this point has always been pretty much ideological or philosophical. There have been disputes between people over legal questions. In the Pentagon Papers case and in the Eisenstadt versus Baird case, the birth control, that the facts of those cases are all pretty well established and pretty well conceded by both sides. The fight was over the philosophy and the legal principles to be applied. It was actually a clash of worldviews, as I've talked with you about before. And though the Pentagon Papers case did in fact reveal a lot of information that had been intentionally concealed from the American public about the Vietnam War, the fight in the court was primarily an ideological fight about whether or not they ought to have a right to publish these papers and whether they thought it was a good idea to publish them. And you saw the Douglas opinion where he was extolling the virtues of whoever the source was of giving up these papers and how these were the exact kind of information the First Amendment was designed to get to the people. And then you saw on the other side Berger suggesting that whoever it is be criminally prosecuted, and Larry McKay calling him a traitor. So the arguments had been ideological. But now, in the victory in those cases was pretty much a function of your legal scholarship, your intellectual adroitness in being able to muster the philosophical positions in favor of something, and of course the political power that the different worldview adherents had to get a president elected, to get members of the United States Senate elected who nominate and approve judges. So that if you had the judges on your appellate courts, et cetera, their political ideology or philosophy was very important in determining how these ideological disputes would be resolved. But now with Watergate, we start to open into an important area here in this course where we start to encounter a lot of cases where, well, yes, there's a major ideological confrontation going on. The really controlling element of these cases is factual, that there is something being concealed. There are secrets and mysteries going on now in these cases where the people who are engaged in a certain kind of activity know perfectly well if the facts are revealed to the public that they will lose, that they will be punished, they will be stopped from doing what they're doing, and so that they undertake great effort to keep concealed the facts that are going on. And so that the skill set that is necessary now to deal with these kind of cases, while you still have to have the same kind of legal acumen and the kind of intellectual agility and philosophical clarity to deal with these issues, you have to figure out how to find out factually what's going on in these cases. And so I end up at the firm of F. Lee Bailey. I was brought in originally because Bailey had been indicted. F. Lee Bailey, who was the #1 criminal defense attorney in the country at the time, had been indicted as a co-conspirator with a fellow by the name of Glenn W. Turner. And I won't go into great length about that whole case, but basically Glenn W. Turner is the guy who started the multi-level sales that turned out Amway and all these other things where you buy a franchise and then you sell a subdivision of your franchise and you get a portion of the profits of the things they sell, and it goes on down this chain. But anyway, the attorneys general for the states around the country were all catalyptic over this guy Glenn Turner, and they indicted him. And then when he went to get F. Lee Bailey to be his defense attorney, they ended up indicting Bailey too. Asserting that Bailey was getting too cozy with this guy and was actually participating in helping him effectuate his conspiracy. They couldn't quite figure out what the theory was as to what the guy was doing wrong, but they indict Bailey. And Bailey couldn't figure out what to do about this, felt kind of desperate, and so he ended up calling me and asking me if I would come in and defend him. Because he knew there was something wrong, that this was an attempt to deprive Glenn Turner of his Sixth Amendment right to counsel of his own choice. That's why they indicted Bailey, to neutralize him as defense counsel for Turner. And so I came in to do that particular case. And during the course of the effort that I was engaged in from September, October, November of 1972, the events of the Watergate break-in transpired. Now, you've read the details. You saw the details in the video that the teaching assistants assigned, the final report by the National Geographic TV. You saw them go down through the chronology of the things that had happened, and you read the later account of the Law Review article from the McGeorge Law Review, where the guy goes into length about what he thought was kind of inappropriate conduct on the part of Judge Sirica, coercing the defendants into coughing up information about the larger conspiracy. So I won't spend a lot of time reviewing the facts of that case because they're part of history and they're part of what you actually read. But the bottom line is that you'll note for example, that the final report by the National Geographic television people, they end up listing out like about 10 major questions that they thought still remained unanswered about the Watergate break-in. And then they undertook to answer them. All the answers were wrong that they postulated. You know, they were all based on, you know, kind of surmise and speculation and thinking that they'd done a lot of good research and figured stuff out. Well, they were all wrong. And so what I want to do today is I want to tell you why the Watergate break-in case was so important. Now, obviously, it was important because it ended up resulting in the voting in of articles of impeachment on the part of the House of Representatives against Richard Nixon, and it resulted in his resignation. That's very important. First time a president has ever resigned. And it got rid of, you know, the great evil Richard Nixon for our whole generation to boot him out of office and opened the way for, you know, Gerald Ford, who came in to be beaten by Jimmy Carter. So it was important historically. But the fact of the matter is, very much like you saw the attempt on the part of the National Geographic television show to come up with all of these kind of shallow answers as to what the real Nixon ordered the break-in at the Watergate Hotel because he wanted to win big. You know, he didn't want to just win. He wanted to have the biggest victory in history. You know, like as if they figured that out somehow. And then what was Nixon so paranoid about? And they said, he was afraid that Ellsberg, in the publication of the Pentagon Papers case, was going to interfere with the effectiveness of his foreign policy. And that was really what he wanted to really stop that. Basically playing into the hands of the theory that the burglars had, is that they were going in to protect the national security of the United States. Anyway, they go down this long list of these wild surmises about why they thought he had done all these things. But what I want to do is I want to review for you what the actual facts are in this case, so that you will be among the first to know of what actually happened. So here's the key. Here's the key that would happen. Now you all know about the burglary and the guys that went in, and that it was G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt were in the Howard Johnson motel, kind of monitoring this whole thing, and that Jim went in along with the four Cubans, and they went in and were trying to replace the wiretap, the bug in the telephone of Larry O'Brien. And so what was happening there, that they got caught by Schlaffer, Karl Schlaffer, actually. There's a funny bit about this all the time, that you may have heard that these people went into the Watergate Hotel when the burglars were all inside there. They showed up, and Liddy and Hunt saw them from across the street, but they said, no, that can't be police, because they were these kind of street people looking kind of guys that all went in there. That was Karl Schlaffer, who was the head of the organized crime strike force of the Washington, D.C. Police Department. And they'd been working an undercover deal when they got the call. So they came in, arrested these guys, and they brought them in, and they found in the pocket of Bernard Barker a check that had been cleared through a bank, Banco Internacional, down in Mexico City. And they also found a key in the pocket of one of the guys, which turned out to be a room key for the Howard Johnson's motel room. And so they took the key and they went to the Howard Johnson motel room and they went in and they found a number of address books and some other checks and stuff. And that the FBI had all of these and were starting to investigate these. Now this happened on the 17th of June of 1972. And Nixon was down in Key Biscayne along with Haldeman and Ehrlichman and the guys down there. They flew back in on the 20th into Washington, D.C. And there's an interesting set of discussions started going on then. Some in the Oval Office, some not in the Oval Office. But right at the very beginning, Nixon starts suggesting that we think about how to get some money to these guys. These poor guys that are going to be in jail, they need money for lawyers, they need money for their expenses and stuff like that. And he was recommending that to Haldeman right from the very beginning. But it wasn't in the Oval Office. The first meeting that was in the Oval Office was on the 21st of June, and this is the one where he was meeting with Haldeman, and this has got the famous 18.5-minute gap in the tape that you may have heard about. And I've had the good fortune to find out what was in the 18.5-minute gap, and it was Nixon explaining to Haldeman how important it was to seal off this investigation that was going on, that it had to be confined to just those people that were in the Watergate hotel, because if it got out, it was going to leak back out into things that were very, very sensitive, very important national security secrets that would lead all the way to him as the president. He always used to refer to himself as the president. Will lead all the way to the president, moi. Anyway, so he was telling this to Ehrlichman, to Haldeman, and then the so-called smoking gun event that happened on the 23rd is when John Dean basically calls up Haldeman and tells Haldeman that there's this terrible problem. He explains it to Haldeman, and so Haldeman comes into the president's Oval Office at 10:30 in the morning on the morning of June 23rd, and he says, "Mr. President, I think we've got a problem. And the president says, "What is that, John or Bob?" He says, "Well," he says, "I got a call from John Dean. He said that Pat Gray called him. Pat Gray was the acting head of the FBI." Because Hoover had just died 2 months earlier. And so Pat Gray was the acting head of the FBI. And Pat Gray, he said, called Dean and said, "Look, we've got a problem. The check that they found inside the jacket pocket of Bernard Barker, they've traced it back to this bank in Mexico City. And he can't control the FBI." They kept using that phrase. He can't control the FBI. He can't control the FBI. Who he couldn't control was Mark Felt. Mark Felt was the number 2 guy in the FBI. He was the deputy director of the FBI under Hoover. And he had been passed over to be the acting director when Pat Gray got put in. So Mark Felt was the tough guy, the strong guy. The guy had been in the FBI longer. Gray wasn't even in the FBI. He was an outsider. And so Mark Felt told him that he was getting set to fly down on the 23rd of June. He told Pat Gray that he was going to be flying out the next day on the 24th of June, flying down to Mexico City to interview Manuel Ogario. Manuel Ogario, because it turns out that the check in Bernard Barker's pocket had been cleared through the account of an attorney in Mexico City by the name of Manuel Ogario in Banco Internacional. And so Mark Felt was going to go down and interview him. And as soon as he told Pat Gray that, Pat Gray got on the telephone and called John Dean and told him that was that going to cause any difficulty for the president. And so that's what John Dean wanted to find out. So he told Haldeman. Haldeman goes in and on the videotape, he says, "Mr. President, Dean wants to know whether or not them going into that investigation is going to cause any trouble for the White House." Big long pause on the tape, and Richard Nixon says, "Bob, I want you to get a hold of John," that's Ehrlichman, "and I want you to go on over to the agency, and I want you to meet with Dick Helms and Vernon Walters. Vernon Walters, the deputy director for the agency, and Dick Helms was the director. And I want you to tell them that they've got to get out of this investigation right now. And Haldeman says, well, Mr. President, what am I supposed to tell them? Why? He said, well, you tell them if they don't get out of this right now, all the Mexico stuff. Actually, he said all the stuff about the water, all the stuff about the Bay of Pigs guys could all come out. And Haldeman says, well, will they know what that means? And he says, oh, they'll know what that means. Okay? And so it turns out that they go over that afternoon to see Dick Helms, and they tell him that the president has said that you need to call the FBI, you need to call Pat Gray, and tell him that the CIA wants you to get out of this investigation right now. And so Helms said, why should we do that? The break-in doesn't have anything to do with us. And so he says, well, the president has told me to tell you that if you don't get this thing stopped, all the stuff could come out about the Bay of Pigs guys. The whole Bay of Pigs thing could be opened up again. And it turns out that they went, okay. And Vernon Walters went downstairs, called Pat Gray. Pat Gray came over, and they had a meeting, which Gray has talked about. Now, we knew this at the time. I knew this in the firm. That what happened is he said to him, he said, look, you've got to stop this investigation right now, because if you allow this investigation to go south of Mexico City, it could touch upon a very sensitive operation that the Bay of Pigs guys were involved in. Okay? Now that's the key thing. I get told this in May of 1973. When I'm asked, once we get all the charges dismissed against F. Lee Bailey, Bailey shifts me over onto the case with McCord. And so I start getting briefed on what's going on, and it turns out that actually I was sitting in the Gold Key Motel down in Orlando, Florida, because the case against Bailey and Turner was in the Northern District in Tallahassee with Judge Joe Flatt. So I was there at the Gold Key Motel. I was assigned to watch and monitor the beginning of the Watergate hearings. And so this is on the 24th of May, and Jerry Alch, our partner, the three trial lawyers in the office were F. Lee Bailey, Jerry Alch, and myself. And Jerry Alch had been called in front of the Watergate committee. And so he's there on national television, everybody in the country watching, right? And so I'm in the Gold Key Motel room, and my investigator, Bill Taylor, is sitting next to me. And Lee Bailey, standing in the back of the room. We're watching the television. And Dan Inouye from Hawaii is questioning Jerry Alch. He says, Mr. Alch, he says, you're the attorney for James McCord, is that correct? He said, yes. He said, Mr. McCord is the wiretap specialist who is accused of having placed the bugs in the office of Larry O'Brien. Is that correct? He said, yes, that's correct. That's the charge. He said, and you're a partner in the F. Lee Bailey law firm, aren't you, in Boston? He said, yes, I am. And he said, isn't Mr. Bailey your partner under federal indictment at the present time for mail fraud? And he said, well, actually, no, he's not. That all those charges have been dismissed, which they had been by that time. At which point Dan Inouye goes, because he didn't know that, right? A big screw up on the part of his staff. And so the rest of his questions didn't mean anything. And he said, if he were still under indictment, couldn't someone get the impression that your office was trying to do a favor for somebody very high up in the administration? At which point Jerry Alch said, well, he's not under indictment. So obviously that's not an intelligence surmise of any kind, you know. And so anyway, goes grumbling away, but in the back of the room, Lee Bailey all of a sudden like freaks out, and he opens up the door and he goes out into the hall and starts slugging quarters into a pay telephone, which I thought was a little strange because he always used to carry this great big gigantic briefcase around with a telephone in it, which this is 1973. You know, this big telephone like this with a big antenna on it, and he could always talk to people on this special telephone that he had, which I could never figure out what it was. But it was really peculiar that he was pumping money into the payphone. So I turned to Bill Taylor and I say to Taylor, what the hell is that all about? He said, I don't know. And I said, well, find out. And so he ends up going to talk with Bad Andy Tooney. Bad Andy was the chief investigator for the Bailey Law Firm's private investigation firm. We had 40 Class A licensed gun toters that were our investigators at the law firm. And so Bill goes to talk with Bad Andy, and Andy starts to explain to him what had actually happened here. And so here it is. This is May 25th now of 1973. And so I am, let's see, in 73, I am, 28 years old at that time. And I'm sitting there having them tell me what it is that's happened here. Well, it turns out that F. Lee Bailey was on what they call Index 4. Index 4 is a classified list of attorneys who are to be contacted in the event that any CIA agent is caught engaged in domestic activity, which is completely prohibited by the CIA charter. And so there are 4 attorneys on this list, and Lee Bailey was one of them. And so he had been contacted to represent James McCord, and he'd been contacted by somebody in the agency to do that. And so we had been instrumental by this time in getting. I thought it was very cool that we got James McCord to actually agree to blow the whistle on these guys. I mean, McCord, the other guys had pled guilty. Hunt pled guilty, and all 4 of the Cubans had pled guilty, but McCord would not plead. McCord would not plead. He held out, and he went to trial. And we ended up getting him to write a letter to Judge Sirica when it came time for the sentencing, and James McCord wrote a letter to Sirica, telling Sirica that in fact that there had been political pressure applied to them to plead guilty and to remain silent and not to reveal any other information, but that in fact there had been a whole number of these kind of burglaries that had gone on, and it led all the way into the White House, and he's the one that put the finger on Richard Nixon. And we thought that was pretty cool, and I figured that we'd done a great service for the country in getting this to happen. But all of a sudden, I started realizing that there was something strange going on here. That it turns out that Lee Bailey, who I was working with in the law firm, in his law firm, was working with the CIA. James McCord was with the CIA. He is the one that blew the whistle on him. And it turns out that the reason for it is because Richard Nixon had personally directed Jeb Stuart Magruder to instruct the plumbers to go into the Watergate Hotel to wiretap the telephones of Larry O'Brien. And the reason was that he wanted to find out whether Larry O'Brien, who had just been elected to be the head of the Democratic National Committee, knew about the following. And that is this. Turns out that Larry O'Brien, prior to his becoming head of the Democratic National Committee, had been for a number of years the chief lobbyist in Washington, D.C. for Howard Hughes. Now, how many of you here know who Howard Hughes is? A few, all mostly over 30 here. But anyway, Howard Hughes was a multi-billionaire who invented the Spruce Goose, which was the prototype for the C-5A cargo plane. He was a very swashbuckling guy, a multi-millionaire. He owned a Hollywood studio. He was married to 2 or 3 major Hollywood actresses, and he had retired suddenly. After they were making fun of him, he designed this gigantic airplane, which they called the Spruce Goose. And it was down in Long Beach. And he actually, they were all saying what a jerk he was and how what a dumb invention, this thing could never fly, look at the size of that thing. And he flew it. He personally flew the thing all up around the ocean in front of everybody and landed it on the ocean and then retired into anonymity.
You mentioned the DiCaprio film.
Well, there is a DiCaprio film. What's the name of that film? The Aviator. He plays Howard Hughes in that film, DiCaprio, But anyway, so what happens is that he didn't really go away. What he did is he became a covert asset for the National Security Agency of the United States. He set up a corporation called the Summa Corporation. He invented a thing called the Glomar Explorer, which was a basic ocean-going craft that was able to pick up submarines off the bottom of the ocean floor. He designed a series of other things that I'm not at liberty to go into here that we know about, but that were extremely sensitive national security things. And because of this, he got to be quite familiar with Richard Nixon, because Richard Nixon chaired the 5412 Committee of the National Security Council from 1952 to 1960 during the 2 4-year terms of Eisenhower. After the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency, Richard Nixon, as the vice president, chaired the 5412 Committee in charge of covert operations and came to know Howard Hughes very well. And so what he did, Richard Nixon, as it turns out, after he received the nomination for the presidential nomination for the Republican Party in 1960, in June, he contacted Howard Hughes by secure telephone and told Howard Hughes that he wanted Hughes to set up an assassination team to assassinate Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and Che Guevara and the 5 other leaders of the then new revolutionary government in Cuba, saying, you cut off the head of the snake and the snake will die. And so he asked Howard Hughes to do that, and Hughes on the phone call did not agree to do it, but he didn't disagree. And so when they ended up hanging up, Howard Hughes ends up calling in one of his young lawyers, a fellow named Robert Mayhew, Bob Mayhew, and he tells him that the president, that's how he refers to it, that Nixon, now everybody assumed that Nixon was going to win. I mean, Nixon had been the vice president for 8 years. Eisenhower was a very popular guy. The Democrats were going to nominate this young kid from Massachusetts whose father, Joe Kennedy, basically bought the nomination for him. And everybody expected he was going to win. So when Nixon calls to talk with Howard Hughes, Hughes goes to see Bob Mayhew, his lawyer, and says, the president called, he wants us to put together this assassination team to kill Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and Che Guevara and these other guys. See what you can do about that. And so Bob Mayhew, this is in Las Vegas now because Howard Hughes was living in Las Vegas. He lived up over the big casino that he owned there. And Bob Mayhew went to see Johnny Roselli. Johnny Roselli was the representative in Las Vegas to one of the big casinos that was owned by Sam Giancana, the head of the mafia in Chicago. And Bob Mayhew went to see Johnny Roselli and says, look, you guys have your own reasons for wanting to get rid of Fidel Castro. He shut down all of your gambling casinos. He shut down your houses of prostitution. He cut off the heroin supply coming in from Southeast Asia, coming in through Cuba that you guys run. So you got your own reasons for wanting to kill Castro. And the President Nixon, would-be President Nixon, wants you to do this. Would you do this for him? And so Johnny Roselli says, look, I'm going to have to check with my principal on this. And so Johnny Roselli flies to Chicago in June of 1972 and meets with Sam Giancana and tells him what Nixon has asked to have done. Sam Giancana says, well, look, we can't just do this ourselves. This is Santos Trafficante's territory. Santos Trafficante was the Don of the Mafia in Havana up until January of 1959. And at which point the revolution took place. So he fled from Cuba, came up to Tampa, and had his people there. And it turns out they had been working with Nixon, because Richard Nixon, as the head of the 5412 Committee, immediately after the revolution in Cuba, has set up a covert operation with the Central Intelligence Agency operating out of Miami called Operation 40. And they were actually having anti-Castro expatriate Cubans go down into Cuba and set fire to their sugar crops, a poison sugar that had been put into these big freighters to be moved out, blowing up bridges and things, trying to disrupt the economy to try to prove that a government that was not completely friendly to the United States couldn't survive. And so he said, look, we've got to deal with Trafficante. So we'll go down and see him about this. So they go down, and in the third week of June of 1972, there's a set of meetings take place, 3 meetings take place in the Fontainebleau Hotel down in Miami. In those meetings are Bob Mayhew, Johnny Roselli, Sam Giancana, and Santos Trafficante. And after the second meeting, there was an agreement in principle that Trafficante would be willing to put together an assassination team, but he had to make certain that this was coming directly from Nixon, and he wanted to have verification of that. So in the third meeting, a guy shows up in the meeting using the nom de guerre, Mr. Ed. It turns out that was Sheffield Edwards, who was the chief of security of the Central Intelligence Agency. Shows up and gives them the nod, the go-ahead, to go ahead and do this. So Santos Trafficante, being no jerk, figures out that what he's going to do is he's going to take guys that are former gunmen for him down in Havana, that used to work for him as enforcers in the houses of prostitution and the heroin business and the gambling casinos, who are now working with the Central Intelligence Agency under Nixon out of Operation 40. What he's going to do is he's going to recruit a number of those people to come in and be the shooters on the team, so that if anything happens that they get caught, people are going to think they're CIA guys, and that the CIA will have to cover for these guys. And so that's what he does. He recruits 15 of his former gunmen. They organize them into a thing called the S-Force. S is in Sam. They organize the S-Force, and they spread them out in these 5 paramilitary bases that are all down in the southeastern section of the United States. One on No Name Key, one on Swan Island, one in the Everglades, and 2 in Louisiana at Lake Pontchartrain, one on the southern end and northern end. And there are these 5 bases. These 15 anti-Castro Cubans are all spread out into these bases. And what happens is they have private airplanes come and pick them up and fly them out of those bases secretly to a place called Fort Huachuca in Arizona. And they come into Fort Huachuca, they sign in, and then they disappear. And it turns out that where they're being brought is they are flown down to Mexico, to a place in Oaxaca, Mexico, actually on the ranch of a fellow by the name of Cliff Murchison, Jr. Clint Murchison, Jr., his father is the owner of the Santa Anita racetrack in California. Very wealthy family. They owned the Dallas Cowboys, the Dallas Texans originally. And so this guy has got a ranch down in Oaxaca, Mexico. Remember, Hoover and his friends used to go to the Santa Anita racetrack in California, used to vacation there. And so this guy's son ends up owning a ranch down in Oaxaca. So they set up a triangular fire team base to train these 15 guys. When they disappear from these bases and go through Fort Huachuca, they're down there being trained. The guy who's in charge of training them is a guy named Carl Jenkins, former U.S. Marine Corps, now Special Forces guy. He's the trainer of these guys, training them in a coordinated triangular fire team to fire from 3 separate points onto a moving target to assassinate someone there. That operation gets put together and is running, and Nixon also begins a plan to stage an invasion of Cuba. As soon as he gets elected and comes back into his second term in the beginning of 1962 actually, 1961, in April of 61, he's planning to have a handful of these anti-Castro Cubans go into Cuba, go into the Bay of Pigs, set up a base on the beach, raise the flag, and declare free Cuba. And Nixon is going to have United States Marines based on naval ships go in behind him, go in behind them and recognize them. The U.S. is going to recognize them as the new government of Cuba, and the U.S. Marines are going to go in and take over the island and throw out Castro. That's the plan he's got going, right? So the election, the campaign is going on. This secret covert operation has been set up, the S-Force at the behest of Nixon, and it's being trained down in Oaxaca, Mexico, at this base. And it turns out that the place is being financed down there by a skim being taken off the casinos in Las Vegas, that they have cash in the casinos in Las Vegas. And so they're skimming the cash off the casinos, the mob is, and they're putting it in Cadillac automobiles in big suitcases and transferring it through New Orleans to Miami and depositing the cash in the Miami National Bank, owned by Meyer Lansky. And then the money is wired from there into the International Credit Bank in Geneva, Switzerland. And then it's wired down into the a piece of it's wired down into the Banco Internacional, into the account of an attorney by the name of Ogario. And that's the account that was being used to funnel the money that was going in to fund the base in Oaxaca. And so that when Richard Nixon tells Bob Haldeman to go over and tell Dick Helms that they've got to shut down the investigation of the Watergate burglary, because if you don't, all of the Mexico stuff about the Bay of Pigs guys could come out. That's what they're talking about down there. And that, and one might guess that that's reason enough for the CIA to be extremely upset about revealing the fact that they had been tangentially involved in assisting an assassination operation to try to kill Fidel Castro. But that brings us to the end of our time together today. And so that I'll suggest to you that the reason that they were really concerned about this is because that's the group that killed the president in November of 1963. That is the gun team that killed the president, and that's what Richard Nixon was terrified about, because he had been the one that actually instigated creating that group, and they had been the ones that were involved in killing the president. And if that became known, it was the only possible thing that could have stopped him from beating George McGovern in the election in 1972. So there's our lecture for today. There's some more. You may have a question or two, and so that I give everybody till about 8 or 9 after to everybody get here in time, so we can get started, so that we have time at the end here for some additional questions. And now a lot of the rest of the questions we'll deal with this whole issue of the assassination of the president and the hearings that were held after the Watergate trial and all of that. We'll be dealing with those on Thursday. But this was the Watergate burglary is an introduction into that major investigation. And so that what I want to direct our attention here to questions about the Watergate burglary. You've done the reading. There's lots of books that you can find about this. As long as you keep in mind that as soon as they start to wander away from the simple facts of what happened during the burglary and who was involved in it, when they start speculating as to why it happened and what it was they were looking for, and did the president know about it or not, did he approve of any of this stuff, just know that all of the answers that they provide are incorrect, because this is actually what happened. And when I found out about what this was all about, that's when I left the Bailey firm and didn't want to stay there anymore to participate in that. And we'll talk next time about the hearings that followed and how it led to this information. Okay?
2 questions, 3 questions. And if anybody needs to get up and go, you're welcome to do it.
But anyway, we got started a few minutes late to make sure everybody was here. But so if anybody wants to ask any questions about this, it's pretty startling information, I realize. You may be a little dumbfounded to ask questions, but anyway, what questions do you have about this?
So it's obviously about the last portion.
Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how'd you like the play part? Yeah.
I was under the impression that everybody involved in the Bay of Pigs, aka the anti-Castro people, when they got to the island, they ended up getting mowed down by Castro's forces.
Yeah.
So who survived to then train down in Mexico?
Oh no, there were a lot of guys. There were 45 guys taken prisoner down there. They didn't kill them all.
Oh, they didn't?
Oh no.
So they released them back to the U.S.?
Eventually they did, yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
But there were people that were involved in the planning of it, et cetera, but there were some of the people that were there that were actually had been taken prisoner. And what happened is that there's a lot of rumors fly around about how, they were all really angry at Kennedy because he refused air cover for them. It wasn't true at all. that what he refused to do is allow United States Marines to be used to come in behind these people and try to undertake a military overthrow of Castro's government. What he did is he did provide air cover, allowed air cover to be provided. The problem was, I mentioned it to you once before, I think, they were based out of Nicaragua, that Noriega, Somoza was providing sanctuary for them to prepare for the air cover, and they were to fly out of there and come and be over the Bay of Pigs at the appointed time. And the problem is that they were in a different time zone. And so that they were functioning a complete hour off the schedule, just as crazy as that. And they got to the site an hour after they were supposed to be there, and by that time, all of the two major craft that had all the ammunition and resupplies for the guys had all been sunk, and they were trapped on the beach, and they were being hammered, and they were surrounded by military forces of Castro, and so they were all arrested and taken into custody. And then Kennedy admitted that he was involved in this thing, because when Kennedy came into office, it was the first time that he was ever told about the fact that there was this plan to have this invasion of Cuba, and he wouldn't support it. He said, look, if you're telling me, the agency's telling me that if they just land on the beach and they announce a free Cuban government, that all the citizens are going to rise up against Castro because they're so unhappy with him, and let them do it. But we're not going to supply U.S. Marines. But he did not refuse to give them air cover. That was their own complete blunder. And I know because I've talked to the people that were involved in the thing. Yeah, but that's what happened. So, yes.
I'm sorry, all the names are kind of swimming.
Yes, for sure.
I may not get them, but you mentioned that following the Watergate trial, that there were, I think, 4 or 5 defendants who pled guilty.
Yeah, the Cubans pled guilty, and E. Howard Hunt pled guilty.
Right, and then there's the one holdout.
There were 2 of them, Liddy and James McCord.
Okay, why wouldn't the testimony of the other 4 or 5 be used against the 2 holdouts?
Because they didn't testify. That was the reason they pled guilty. They pled guilty and refused to testify, and so they just took the heat. And so that's why Sirica was postponing. He conditionally sentenced them to 25 and 30 years. And the condition was if they would agree to cooperate with the prosecutors, he might reconsider the sentences. But that was still all in the offing, and Liddy refused. Liddy was planning to kill Hunt if he had to keep Hunt from talking. And there's a huge drama that goes on around this thing, because E. Howard Hunt's wife was actually killed in a plane crash with a whole briefcase full of money, $100,000, bringing it to give them the money. And the plane was blown up, actually. And Hunt was convinced that she'd been assassinated. And he was furious that what was going on. And that's why they were terrified that he was going to talk. And Liddy was planning to kill him if he had to, from inside the jail. I mean, Liddy was quite a piece of work. But anyway, those are the 2 guys that held out.
Would there be no way to coerce the testimony?
Well, what they could do is they could waterboard them. No. What they could do is they see once they were convicted, what are you going to do? You know, so what Judge Sirica did is he gave them a 25 and 30 year sentence, and saying that I will consider reducing the sentence if you'll talk, figuring that's going to put lots of pressure on them. But actually, the reason that the Cubans were the ones that went into the hotel is because they were one of the very few people that knew what they were looking for. And they were looking to find out whether Larry O'Brien, who had been the Washington lobbyist for Howard Hughes prior to his becoming the head of the Democratic National Committee, had somehow learned about the role of Nixon with Hughes in setting up the assassination team that had actually killed the president. That's what, and they didn't want anybody else let in on the secret to know what they're looking for. So that's why the Cubans were in there. So anyway, there's the beginning of the discussion we're going to have. This is the lead-in through the Watergate burglary into the hearings that then followed, which we're going to be talking about on Thursday. So in the question that will come up over and over again is, how in the world is it that the Watergate burglary and the resignation of Richard Nixon led to the creation of a special select committee to investigate the assassination of President Kennedy.
So all the information you just told us, this is already written about and it's found in other books as well?
No? The other people weren't representing James McCord.
A lot of this, though.
Oh, the information that you've seen in the record here, you've seen all that account that you read about today, all the stuff of who broke in and all that kind of stuff. But then you'll see they start speculating as to why it was done, and they don't know what they're talking about. Okay.